So it's going to be something a bit smaller.
So it's week 11, it's COMP2106. So what we want to do today is resume with some of the Angular work we started last week. So we built these two simple pages last week. So there was our first one, and our second one was our simple calculator. But we created a lesson 10 folder, but basically it's just included some JavaScript. So we downloaded the minified latest version of Angular, and we added some simple Bootstrap, and we just created some basic HTML files. So in our first one, mostly HTML, the two things that we had here was our ng app, meaning that we could run Angular directives or commands on anything within the HTML document. And then we also added in this one, what did this do? We used ng model on this input box. Anybody remember what ng model happens to do? What's the purpose of it? So this was my hello. All right.
To attach like the JavaScript files to HTML.
Yeah, so what this is doing is making a binding between this HTML input and an Angular value or variable we are calling name. And what does this syntax do on line 22? We had this sort of handlebar or mustache syntax. What is that? What do those represent? Yeah, so it's a dynamic value coming from Angular. So this ng model binds our text box value to a variable, an Angular variable called name, and then we can display that variable with those handlebars or those mustache delimiters, basically represents an Angular value. So that was all we did in the first one. And our second example, we declared an app in our calculator. So we gave this module a name. And then we also created a controller, which we attached here. In this div, it was controlled by that Angular controller. And then we bound our controls using that same ng model. And we could display an Angular variable by calling a function in our JavaScript. What was scope? We talked about this. This was an Angular keyword. We're going to see it all the time. What does scope do here? We've got it mentioned a whole bunch of times. What does it mean? Yeah, so the scope, this is basically a global that allows Angular and any page that uses that JavaScript to see each other, right? So here we had, so all of the things we attached with our ng model, our X, our operator, or Y in our result, scope allows us to reference those things both in our Angular JavaScript file as well as within our HTML, so they can talk to each other. So what we want to do today, we're going to do one other example. We're going to do a really simple to-do list using HTML and Angular, where we can add, view, and delete. We'll leave edit out, but we could add, view, and delete, basically making a mini task list. We won't persist the data to the database. We'll just store it in memory in an Angular array where we can add to that array, view the array, and delete items from the array. Okay. So we're going to do that. I would think we probably should be able to finish that by our first break. If not, it can run a little into the second hour of class, which is fine. And then after that, the rest of class is actually going to be a lab, an AngularJS lab that you're going to do in class. Okay. That probably shouldn't take the rest of the class. And then next week we'll come and we'll look at, so once we've had a couple of weeks to play around with Angular, we'll look at, okay, how do we start to integrate that into the rest of the stack?
We're going to on those coding, like teaching things online for
Yeah.
lab section.
Yeah, I'll show it to you. So I'm going to make a lesson 11 folder. For today. And I'm just going to copy, I don't need the HTML files from last week. And I won't need my calculator, but I'm just going to copy JavaScripts and style sheets. So I'll copy those two folders from last week, or you can just add on into your existing lesson 10 if you want. So I'll paste those into lesson 11. So style sheets is just Bootstrap. JavaScripts is Angular and jQuery. I'm going to get rid of calculator.js. So I have two style sheets and two JavaScripts.
Where do we got rid of the calculator?
Yeah, we don't need the calculator this week. So now I'll open my lesson 11. No, my JavaScript has jQuery and Angular that I downloaded last week, and Style Sheets has the Bootstrap and Bootstrap theme CSS.
So we're removing the
So this is what you should have, right here.
Okay.
So it's the same as last week, except last week we had an additional calculator.js file in the JavaScript folder. We don't need that one this week. We're going to build a different.
And we have read the hello. Okay.
So this is kind of our starting point. Again, you don't have to download these files. We could simply link to them with the content delivery network if we wanted to. We could use fully qualified paths and link to these 4 files online. So I'm going to make a new HTML file, which I will call to do. Put in a title, simple, Angular, to-do list. So what we're going to want on here is a text box and a submit button for the user to add a task. And then when they click add, we want all of the tasks to immediately show up underneath. And then later on, we'll put at the top, we'll be able to display how many tasks we have. So we'll put on here maybe a simple heading. We'll put on a div here that'll have a simple form. In our form, we'll need an input and we'll need a button.
The difference between using the button and an input that is a submit button instead?
Nothing.
Nothing?
This is just new in HTML5. Didn't exist before HTML5. You had to use input type equals submit.
I just wanted to make sure that.
Yep, you certainly can.
So it's not wrong to use it at all?
Not wrong at all.
Okay.
So there's our super simple page so far. Pretty exciting. Okay, click the button, nothing happens. So let's add, we should probably add, let's add our CSS links in the header. Let's add our JavaScript links down here. Oops, that shouldn't be a script, that should be a link. Links. And maybe I'll add a main section. And down at the bottom, we'll add our 2 JS files. Maybe I'll add a class to my button. So I haven't really changed the functionality. We've just linked in our 4 support files, our 2 CSS files in the header, our 2 JavaScript files down at the end of the body. So our page would look something like that. Doesn't really matter if we don't style it. No big deal. So now we're going to need to build a custom JS file that will be able to add, list, and delete any items that are added through our little text box. So we're going to go and add that JavaScript file, then we're going to link it in here, and then we're going to need to add some Angular tags, some Angular attributes to some of the HTML tags we already have. So inside of JavaScript, let's make a new JS file, which we will call do.js. So we want to use an Angular module the way we did last week and give it a name. We'll call it our to-do application. The module is just a way of organizing our code because we may have many modules within an application. And then we need this empty array. What this array signifies is whether this module has any dependencies. Does it depend on any other files in our application? It has no dependencies, so we just have an empty array here. So we did this last week. And now we need to create controller, which we'll call our to-do controller. So we did this, did it last week. Whoops, sorry, that semicolon shouldn't be there. because the module contains the controller. And we have a callback function here with our scope. The scope is what's going to allow us to send values or call functions back and forth between our HTML page and our JavaScript file. So what we'll do here I'm going to create an array called to-dos. This will serve as our list of items, our task list. And we'll just set it equal to an empty array. So we have a blank, we have a list with nothing in it to start. So what we want to do is we need to write a function to add or to create a new to-do item, and we'll have to tie it to this text box. Whatever values in that text box will get added onto that array whenever the user clicks the add button. So we're going to need some code here. We're going to need an Angular attribute here as well that will call our function when that button is clicked. So we want to call, we're going to create a function called add. We're going to take our to-dos array, which is empty, and we want to add a new item. So in Angular, the method we have for that, actually it's in this list. Anybody want to guess what function will add an item to an array? Good guess, not join. Push. So push will take a value and add it to an existing array. So now what we're going to need a variable name to represent this input. So what should we call it? Right? The value that's going to get put in here. We need some kind of variable that we're going to have to bind the text box to, and that's the variable we want to send in. Okay, so we can call it anything we like. It's just a variable name. Or we can go task input. So the add function is going to look for a value from our form called task input. So we're going to have to connect up that input box to this variable. So task input represents the value from our text box. So let's go to our form. Right now, our form is not connected to this JavaScript file. So we need to link their JavaScript file in, and then we're going to need to add some attributes so that the form can recognize our app, our controller, and also is that our text box is connected to the value task input. Okay, so we basically have to, we have these two things kind of in isolation. We need to wire them up together now. So the first thing we're going to need is to tie some section. We could do it right in our HTML tag. We could do it in the main tag. So what we want to do is attach it to our Angular application. So we're going to use ng app equals our do app. So any HTML element underneath here in the DOM will have access to that Angular module.
ng app, is that what it is?
Yes.
So is NG app kind of like the equivalent of something else sheet instead of being just do NG app?
Not exactly, because you know what? We still have to link it. It's a very good question, Mackenzie. Let's add the actual link. We actually need to link the JavaScript file itself, and then I'll come back to your question. Let's add our link to. We still need to link it just the way we would link any JavaScript file. Having the app, having the modules, that's actually optional. We don't need to have the module. The idea of putting this code in a module is our application may manage other things like users, accounts, categories. So we would have a separate app. We'd have a user app, a account app, a categories app. It's a way of modularizing the code. So we're saying this page can use that module. We could have multiple modules in here that have separate logic.
So you can link it not with NG app itself.
It would work if we don't create a module, I believe. We may have to change it around a little bit. So now we want to, maybe in our body section or our main section, doesn't really matter. We now want to set the ng controller to our to-do controller. So now anywhere in the body, we'll have access to the functions and variables inside that controller. So we have an add function, and we have a variable called task input. So inside our controller, we have a to-dos array, we have an add function, and we have a task input variable. So now we should be able to access any of those things from any element in the body. So we need two more Angular tags. The first one needs to go on our input. How are we going to wire up or bind this box to one of the values in our JavaScript file? And which value do we want to connect to that input box? Good guess. We don't need the mustache. The mustache is when we're displaying a value. Well, which value on this page, what's the value in our JavaScript file that we want to connect to this input box?
Task input.
Yeah, the task input represents the value the user's typed. So what tag would we need here to connect it? We used it last week. It's one of the ng tags. Here's our file from last week. Yeah, we want to use that ng model tag. That performs the binding. So this scope variable in Angular is connected up. So those names have to be the same, and it's case sensitive. That creates this two-way binding. So when we change the value in our form, scope.taskInput will always represent that current value. If we change scope input in our JS file, then the value is going to get changed in our text box. Okay, so that binding is circular. It's two-way, from HTML to JavaScript and from JavaScript back to HTML. And Angular will keep those two values consistent at all times. So now we need to do one more thing. On our button, when the user clicks the button, we want to call the add function that will look for our task input value and add it to our array. So we need one new attribute that we haven't used. Anybody want to take a stab at ng-something?
Add.
Good guess, Scott.
So
What is the user doing with the button?
clicking.
Yeah, they're clicking. So the tag is actually, you got it, Brandon. ng-click. So this is basically an Angular event handler. When the button is clicked, trigger an Angular event. What do we want to happen? What's the name of the function in our to-do controller that we want to call when the user clicks the button? Yeah, we want to call the add function. So our body tag is wired up to our controller. Our text box is connected to a variable called task input. And our button, when it's clicked, will call the add function here. Now, we won't see anything when this happens yet because we haven't displayed the list. But let's see if we can do this and at least check our console and see if we get any kind of error. So we're not actually doing anything we've never done before. We're just doing it in a different way than we've ever done it before.
This would be so much easier if we could use this for our assignment.
Right. So we should check our console. I like the Chrome console better. We'll just jump to Chrome for a minute. So let's just check if we get any errors when we submit. No errors so far, but we don't actually know if it's getting added to our list because we can't see, we don't know what's in our list yet. Now we could try here. Let's see. I'm not sure if we can use console.log here. We'll try it.
Isn't your form getting submitted and redirected whenever you click the button?
No, because Angular interrupts it.
It's not interrupted.
So I'm going to try logging it.
No.
Okay. So it is adding. So you can see the binding, right? By using ng model here, that value is passed. Our add function gets called every time we click that button. And you'll notice, Brandon, to see the interruption, you'll notice that the browser doesn't flicker at all, right? This stuff doesn't reload. The page is not reloading. You'll notice nothing really changes. There's no reload. So Angular interrupts that normal HTML submission flow.
Can you have multiple controllers on one page?
Yes.
Because like you reference it in the body, and then you just like in the actual like for the input, you're just referencing the variable in a function.
Okay, so this is why we have different apps and different controllers. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to think of an example. Here, let's pull up a page that has a lot of stuff going on. Maybe let's go to Amazon. Let's search for a book on Angular. That's a very good question, Adam. So there's a lot going on here, right? You know, there's information here about the product, right? So there could be a product controller. So this might be a div or section where the ng controller is product, and it can display product variables. There's then a separate section or div that would have maybe a reviews ng controller equals reviews controller, right? And that would have its own functions, its own, you know, a separate related products, right? So we're not limited. If I put it on the body, I'm not going to be able to use additional controllers. But if we wanted to use additional controllers, that's a very good question. We could just attach it into a div instead. So that way we could do different, we could do, use different controllers all on one page if we want.
So if my submission isn't getting interrupted, what have I done wrong?
Is there any error in the console? So you've attached the controller. Did you put any attributes in your form tag? Not that it should really matter.
Do I have, there's blank action.
Try taking that out. So that's an important point to note, that when we add, so that our button calls an Angular function, it interrupts the default behavior. It's not going to post the full page or do a get and do a full page reload. This is part of the beauty of Angular. It overrides that behavior and basically keeps us where we are. That fixed it. So, okay, so Brandon, I want to recreate what you had just so we can see. So what did you have here?
So it was just and then not. So equals and then that was it.
Okay, so when I do that, right, so you can see it flashes. So we don't actually want to specify the action because the action will be handled on the server. If we don't specify the action, then the Angular event handler overrides the default behavior. So we don't want to specify a method or an action in this case. So it looks like we can add, but we can't really tell yet. So what we're going to do, I think this is a good time for us to take a break. When we come back, what we want to do is underneath this is we want to add a list. We'll create an unordered list. So every time a user adds a to-do, it gets displayed on the screen so we can actually see. So we're going to we have this add function, but we're also going to want to be able to display, and then we're going to add the ability to delete from that list using Angular as well. Any other questions so far about what we've done here? Okay, let's take a pause here and we'll finish this after our break.